My ex-fiancé laughed when the receptionist scanned my invitation. Then her face went pale. For a second I thought maybe the scanner had malfunctioned. Corporate events are full of little glitches, dead QR codes, wrong guest lists, forgotten badges. But this wasn't that. The young woman behind the reception desk stared at her screen, blinked twice, then looked directly at me. "Just a moment, ma'am." The smile disappeared from her face. She grabbed a phone. A few feet away, my ex-fiancé Greg Turner let out a chuckle. "I told you," he said to the woman standing beside him. Linda always did have a flair for dramatic entrances. Sandra laughed. That hurt more than Greg's comment. Sandra Mills had been my best friend for over 30 years. We'd survived bad perms in the 80s, our kids' soccer years, aging parents, layoffs, divorces among friends, and every other bump life throws at people. At least I thought we had. Now she stood next to the man she helped steal from me. The receptionist spoke quietly into the phone. A few seconds later, she looked up. Her eyes widened. Then she said words that changed the atmosphere of the entire lobby. "Sir, she's here." I followed her gaze. Standing near the ballroom entrance was Harold Bennett, chairman of Bennett Industrial Holdings, the man responsible for one of the biggest manufacturing mergers in the Midwest that year. He immediately started walking toward us. Fast. The smile disappeared from Greg's face. "What the hell?" he muttered. I didn't say a word. Because honestly, I wasn't completely sure what was happening either. Harold reached us and extended both hands. "Linda Harper." His face lit up. "Thank goodness. We were beginning to worry traffic had delayed you." The receptionist looked relieved. Several nearby executives turned to stare. Greg looked from Harold to me and back again. Sandra's mouth actually fell open. Harold continued. "Your seat is ready. Everyone's excited to finally meet you." Then he lowered his voice slightly. "And Robert's already inside." That made me smile. "I figured he'd be early." Harold laughed. "He's been here since 4. That sounded exactly like Robert Gaines. The old man arrived early to everything. Church dinners, board meetings, fishing trips, funerals. If an event started at 6, Robert was there by 4:30. Harold placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "Come on." As we started toward the ballroom, Greg stepped forward. "Excuse me." Harold stopped. Greg straightened his expensive suit jacket. "I'm Greg Turner, Senior Vice President at Horizon Logistics." Harold nodded politely. "I know who you are." Greg smiled. Then Harold added, "We'll be hearing your presentation tomorrow morning." Greg's smile faded slightly. "Right." Harold looked back toward me. "Linda, let's get you inside." And just like that, Greg was dismissed. Not rudely, not dramatically, simply overlooked, which somehow seemed worse. As Harold guided me toward the ballroom, I could practically feel Greg and Sandra staring holes through my back. The ballroom itself was beautiful. Crystal chandeliers, white linen tables, large displays showing company milestones, waiters carrying trays of wine and appetizers. The kind of event that celebrates success while quietly reminding everyone who's important. 3 years ago, I would have fit right in. Back then, I was a marketing executive living in Naperville. Back then, Greg and I were engaged. Back then, Sandra was still my friend. Funny how quickly life can rearrange itself. Harold led me to a table near the stage. Several people stood when I approached. I recognized a few faces from previous meetings. Others I knew only through video calls. Everyone greeted me warmly. Everyone except one person. Robert Gaines. He stayed seated, crossed his arms, squinted at me, then said, "You're late." I checked my watch. I arrived 20 minutes early. "You should have arrived 30. I laughed. The entire table laughed with me. Robert finally grinned. At 72, he still looked like the toughest man in Illinois. He'd spent decades building manufacturing companies before retiring. 3 years earlier, he'd changed my life, although nobody in this room knew that story except him. A waiter brought sparkling water. I took a sip. My hands were steadier than I expected. But inside, I felt old wounds stirring. Because seeing Greg and Sandra together again had opened doors I'd spent years trying to close. Not because I missed Greg. I didn't. That chapter ended long ago. What lingered was something harder to explain. The humiliation, the betrayal, the way my entire life had collapsed so quickly after discovering their affair. Sometimes people assume heartbreak is about losing a relationship. For me, it was losing certainty, losing trust, losing the future I'd spent years planning. And standing inside that ballroom brought all those memories closer than I'd expected. Robert seemed to notice. "You okay?" I nodded. "Just thinking. Never a safe activity." I smiled. still giving terrible advice, for free. That earned another laugh. The evening continued. People mingled. Conversations flowed. Business leaders moved from table to table. Everything felt normal, until I noticed Greg standing near the far side of the room. Watching. Not participating. Watching. Sandra stood beside him. They were clearly trying to figure out why I was there. More importantly, why people with actual influence seemed interested in me. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The truth was, if someone had shown me this scene 3 years earlier, I wouldn't have believed it either. Because 3 years ago, I wasn't sitting beside chairmen and board members. 3 years ago, I was sitting alone in my kitchen wondering how my life had fallen apart so completely. And if you had told me then that one day I'd walk into this exact ballroom as an honored guest, I would have laughed in your face. Because I had no idea what was waiting for me after everything Greg and Sandra did. No idea that losing them would eventually lead me somewhere neither of them could imagine. And no idea that tonight was only the beginning. The funny thing about betrayal is that people only see the moment it happens. They don't see everything that came before it. They don't see the years of loyalty, the sacrifices, the compromises, the thousands of ordinary moments that made you believe someone would never hurt you. As I sat at that table inside the ballroom watching Greg and Sandra from across the room, my mind drifted back 3 years. Back to the life I thought was permanent. At the time I was 49 years old. I lived in a comfortable condo in Naperville about 40 minutes outside Chicago. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a small balcony overlooking a pond. Enough space for me and Greg. We'd been together 7 years, engaged for almost 2. Like many couples our age, we'd both been through previous relationships. We weren't chasing fairy tales anymore. We wanted stability, partnership, someone to grow older with. At least that's what I thought we both wanted. Greg worked in logistics management. He was ambitious, always talking about promotions, networking events, and executive opportunities. I admired that drive. Honestly, I supported it. More than I should have. There were countless nights when Greg sat at our dining room table preparing presentations while I reviewed every slide. I'd catch spelling mistakes, suggest improvements, rewrite sections that sounded weak. Sometimes I'd stay up past midnight helping him prepare for meetings. He'd kiss my forehead and say, "I couldn't do this without you." At the time, I believed him. Because it felt good to help someone you love succeed. My career was doing well too. I worked as a marketing executive for a regional manufacturing company. Nothing glamorous, but I enjoyed it. I had a solid reputation and a dependable income. Life felt stable, predictable, comfortable. And Sandra was part of that life. She'd been my closest friend since we were 21. We met working retail during college. Over the years, we'd celebrated marriages, birthdays, promotions, and family milestones together. When her mother died, I was there. When my father passed away, she sat beside me at the funeral. That's what made what happened next so difficult. It wasn't one betrayal. It was 2. And they came from the 2 people I trusted most. I discovered the affair completely by accident. It was a Thursday afternoon in October. Rainy, cold. One of those gray Illinois days where darkness arrives early. I left work around 3 because a client meeting had been canceled. I decided to surprise Greg with dinner. Nothing special, just takeout from his favorite Italian place. I remember carrying 2 bags of food into the condo building. I remember balancing a container of lasagna while digging for my keys. I remember feeling happy. That's the part that still sticks with me. I was happy. Then I opened the door. At first, nothing looked unusual. The television was on. A lamp was lit. Someone was laughing. Then I heard Sandra's voice. For a split second, I assumed she'd stopped by unexpectedly. That happened all the time. Then I walked into the living room. And there they were. Together. Not talking. Not sitting across the room. Together. The image burned itself into my memory instantly. Greg's face. Sandra's face. The shock. The panic. The guilt. The realization that they'd been caught. Nobody said anything for several seconds. I dropped the takeout bags. One container burst open on the floor. Marinara sauce everywhere. It's strange what your brain notices during traumatic moments. I barely remember what anyone said. But I remember that spilled sauce. Sandra stood first. "Linda." I held up my hand. "No." Greg started talking. Trying to explain. Trying to minimize. Trying to create some version of events that sounded less horrible. I don't remember his exact words. I only remember one sentence clearly. Sandra looked at me and quietly said, "We didn't mean for you to find out this way." As if there was a better way. As if there was a version of this that wasn't devastating. The next few weeks felt like moving through fog. Greg moved out almost immediately. Sandra disappeared. Mutual friends started choosing sides. That was another surprise. Many people sided with Greg. Not openly, not aggressively, but subtly. They kept inviting him to events, kept answering his calls, kept pretending the situation wasn't what it clearly was. Some even suggested I should move on. One woman actually told me, "These things happen." I wanted to ask whether she'd feel the same if it happened to her. Instead, I simply stopped answering her calls. The emotional damage was bad enough. The professional consequences came later. My performance at work suffered. I couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, couldn't think clearly. I made mistakes, missed deadlines. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to remind me I wasn't functioning at my best. Eventually, I resigned. Officially, it was my decision. Unofficially, I knew I needed a fresh start. By the following spring, I'd sold the condo. I moved into a smaller house near Rockford. A quiet neighborhood. Tree-lined streets. Retired couples walking dogs every evening. The kind of place where nobody asked many questions. For a while, I kept mostly to myself. I did consulting work. Paid bills. Tried to rebuild. Some days were better than others. There were mornings when getting out of bed felt like an accomplishment. I questioned everything. My judgment. My future. My value. The confidence I'd spent decades building seemed to vanish overnight. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. I was having coffee at a diner called Mary's Place. Nothing fancy. Just eggs, bacon, and regular customers who knew each other's names. I was reading emails when someone stopped beside my booth. Linda Harper. I looked up and nearly dropped my coffee. Robert Gaines grinned. "Well, you look surprised." I was. The last time I'd seen him was years earlier through a professional association. Even then, he was already semi-retired. We spent nearly 2 hours talking about life, business, getting older, starting over. Eventually, he leaned back and said something that sounded ridiculous. "I need help." I laughed. "With what?" "A company." "Then hire somebody younger." "No." He pointed at me. "I need somebody who knows how to solve problems." I shook my head. "I'm not exactly thriving these days." "Good." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Robert smiled. "People who've never failed usually don't know how to fix anything." That conversation changed everything. At the time, I didn't realize it. I thought he was offering a small consulting project, a temporary distraction, something to keep my mind occupied. I had no idea he was inviting me into a journey that would completely reshape my future, or that the struggling little manufacturing company he wanted me to help save would eventually become the reason I was sitting at one of the most important tables in that ballroom. Back in the present, I looked across the room and saw Greg staring at me again. Confused, suspicious, trying desperately to figure out what he was missing. The truth was simple. 3 years ago, he thought he'd left me behind. What he didn't know was that losing everything had forced me to build something entirely new. And he was about to learn just how much had changed. By 8 o'clock, the ballroom had settled into the comfortable rhythm that corporate events always seem to find. People were eating dinner. Wine glasses clinked. Old colleagues exchanged stories. Executives floated from table to table like politicians working a county fair. Meanwhile, Greg was having a terrible night. I wasn't trying to watch him. Honestly, but he kept making himself impossible to ignore. Every few minutes, I'd glance across the room and catch him looking my way. Not with confidence. Not anymore. With curiosity. And something else. Concern. The first crack appeared when one of the senior executives from Milwaukee stopped at our table. His name was Michael Rhodes. I'd worked with him remotely several times over the past year. We weren't close friends, but we respected each other. Michael shook my hand. "Linda, good to finally see you in person." "You too." Then he smiled. "I've been telling people for months that half the success stories they're celebrating tonight started with your recommendations." I laughed. "That's giving me too much credit." "No, it isn't." He moved on before I could argue. But I noticed Greg watching the entire exchange. The look on his face was almost comical. It reminded me of someone trying to solve a puzzle while missing half the pieces. A little later, another executive approached. Then another. Then another. Nothing dramatic. Just conversations. Introductions. Questions. The kind of attention Greg clearly wasn't expecting me to receive. Sandra seemed equally confused. At one point, I saw her whisper something into Greg's ear. He shook his head. She frowned. The two of them looked like detectives working a case they couldn't crack. For the first time all evening, I found myself smiling. Not because they were uncomfortable, Because the situation was genuinely funny. 3 years ago, they had been absolutely certain they knew everything about me. Now they didn't even know what I did for a living. Life has a sense of humor sometimes. Eventually, dinner was served. Robert sat beside me quietly eating roast chicken. About halfway through the meal, he leaned closer. "You enjoying yourself?" "More than I expected." "Good." I took a sip of water. "You know Greg's trying to figure out what's happening." Robert grinned. "I noticed. He looks confused." "He should." I laughed. Robert took another bite before speaking again. "You planning to tell him?" "No." "Why not?" I looked across the room. Greg was speaking to someone while occasionally glancing our direction. "Because I don't owe him explanations." Robert nodded approvingly. "Excellent answer." Then he lowered his voice. "Besides, tomorrow will explain enough." That was true. Tomorrow morning's board presentation would reveal quite a bit. Far more than Greg expected. The reality was surprisingly simple. 3 years earlier, when Robert asked for my help, the company was struggling. Not collapsing, but struggling. Orders were declining. Processes were outdated. Employee morale was terrible. Several larger competitors were circling like sharks. Most people believed the company would eventually be sold off in pieces. Robert disagreed. So did I. For the next 3 years, we worked, and worked, and worked some more. We reviewed operations, improved marketing, built partnerships, modernized systems, expanded into new markets. Nothing happened overnight. No miracle turnaround. Just thousands of small improvements stacked together. The kind of success nobody notices until it becomes impossible to ignore. Eventually, revenue improved. Then profitability. Then growth accelerated. A year later, larger firms started showing interest. 2 years later, acquisition discussions began. By year 3, the company had become one of the most attractive manufacturing opportunities in the region. What almost nobody knew was that Robert had insisted on compensating me partly with equity. At first, I'd resisted. I wanted consulting fees, predictable income. Robert refused. "I want you thinking like an owner." Looking back, it was one of the smartest decisions anyone ever made for me. Because when the merger finally happened, that equity became extremely valuable. Not billionaire money, nothing remotely close, but enough to change my life. Enough that I no longer worried about retirement. Enough that I could choose projects I cared about. Enough that I finally felt secure again. And Greg had absolutely no idea. A sudden burst of laughter interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see Greg standing with a group of executives near the bar. One of them was a man named David Porter. I'd met David twice. Sharp guy. Friendly. The kind of executive who actually remembered people's names. As I watched David glance toward our table. Then he waved. At me. I waved back. A moment later, I saw Greg smile confidently. Apparently, he assumed the greeting had been intended for him. Then David walked directly past Greg and headed toward our table. The look on Greg's face was priceless. David shook my hand. "Linda, sorry I haven't had a chance to catch up tonight." "No problem." He gestured toward Greg. "Your assistant seems eager to meet everyone." I nearly choked on my water. "My assistant?" David frowned. "The gentleman in the blue suit." For 2 full seconds I couldn't speak. Then I burst out laughing. Robert started laughing too. When I finally caught my breath, I managed to say, "Trust me, he's definitely not my assistant." David looked confused, then embarrassed. "Oh God." "It's okay," I said. "That may be the funniest thing I've heard all year." Even Robert wiped tears from his eyes. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. For months afterward, I would still laugh whenever I remembered it. The evening continued. Speeches began. Awards were presented. Photos were taken. Everything felt pleasant and professional, until Harold Bennett stepped onto the stage. The room quieted immediately. He thanked sponsors, recognized employees, discussed the merger. Then he made an announcement. "Tomorrow morning we'll be unveiling the strategic roadmap that guided this partnership from concept to completion." Polite applause followed. Then Harold added something unexpected. "Much of that roadmap originated from work done by a remarkable advisor sitting in this room tonight." I felt dozens of heads turn toward me, including Greg's. Harold smiled. "We'll say more tomorrow." The applause grew louder. I could actually see Greg processing the information, trying to connect dots, trying to understand why people kept looking at me. Sandra looked uneasy now, not confused. Uneasy. That caught my attention. Because confusion and concern aren't the same thing. And for the first time all evening, I began wondering whether Sandra knew something Greg didn't. The answer arrived 20 minutes later. I was speaking with a former colleague when a woman named Karen approached me. Karen had worked at my old company years ago. She looked nervous. "Linda, can I tell you something?" "Of course." Karen hesitated, then said quietly, "Greg's been using your work." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" "He still presents several of your old strategic frameworks as his own." My stomach tightened. Karen continued, "I assumed you knew." "I didn't." "He references them all the time." Suddenly several things clicked into place. Old presentations, old projects, old ideas I'd developed years earlier. Ideas Greg had helped review. Ideas he now apparently claimed as his own. Karen looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry." I nodded slowly. "No, thank you." Because in that moment I realized tomorrow's presentation might become much more interesting than anyone expected. Especially Greg. He still thought he was attending a corporate celebration. He had no idea he was walking straight toward the biggest mistake of his career. I barely slept that night. Not because I was nervous, and not because I was planning some elaborate act of revenge. The truth was much simpler. Karen's revelation had unsettled me. I spent half the night sitting in my hotel room overlooking downtown Chicago, replaying old memories, old meetings, old presentations, old projects, trying to remember exactly what Greg had access to during those years. At around 1 in the morning, I finally gave up on sleep and made a cup of coffee using the tiny machine in the room. I sat by the window and stared at the city lights. Part of me wanted to ignore everything Karen had said. Move forward. Enjoy the success I'd worked so hard to build. Leave the past where it belonged. But another part of me kept asking the same question. How many times had Greg stood in front of executives and accepted credit for work that wasn't his? And how many opportunities had those stolen ideas helped create? By sunrise, I still didn't have an answer. But I knew one thing. If the truth came out, it wouldn't be because I chased revenge. It would be because Greg made a choice. The same kind of choice he'd been making for years. And choices eventually have consequences. By 8:30 that morning, the conference center was already busy. People carried coffee cups and laptops. Groups gathered near presentation rooms. Executives checked schedules on their phones. The atmosphere felt different from the gala. Less social, more business. I arrived early as Robert always preferred. Naturally, he was already there, sitting in the front row, reading documents, looking annoyed at everyone who wasn't equally prepared. "Morning," I said. "You're late." I laughed. "It starts in 30 minutes. "Exactly. Some things never change." Harold joined us a few minutes later. We reviewed the morning agenda. Everything seemed straightforward. Then Greg walked into the room. For a brief moment our eyes met. He hesitated. Then surprisingly he approached. Sandra wasn't with him. That alone felt unusual. Greg stopped beside my chair. He looked tired. The confidence I'd seen the night before was noticeably weaker. "Linda." "Greg." An awkward silence followed. Finally he said, "I didn't realize you'd become involved with Bennett." "I didn't realize a lot of things either." His jaw tightened slightly. "Fair enough. I was hoping we could talk sometime." "About what?" He hesitated. That told me everything. Because people who genuinely want to apologize usually know exactly what they want to say. People looking for information often don't. "We've both changed." I nodded. "That's true." Another uncomfortable pause. Then someone called his name from across the room. Greg glanced over. When he looked back at me, I could see frustration behind his eyes. Not guilt. Not regret. Frustration. Because he still didn't understand what was happening. A few minutes later, he returned to his seat. The presentation began at 9 sharp. The room filled quickly. Nearly 200 attendees. Executives, board members, investors, department leaders. The kind of audience where reputations can be built or damaged. Harold opened the session. Then several teams presented financial results and integration plans. Everything proceeded smoothly. Until Greg's segment. He stepped onto the stage confidently. Blue suit. Perfect tie. Wireless microphone clipped neatly to his jacket. The Greg I remembered. Polished. Prepared. Comfortable in front of a crowd. His presentation focused on strategic growth planning, supply chain development, market expansion, partnership opportunities. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. Then I recognized one of the slides. My stomach dropped. A circular framework appeared on the screen. 6 categories connected by directional arrows. Customer retention, regional partnerships, operational efficiency, brand trust, workforce development, community engagement. I knew that framework because I created it 8 years earlier at my dining room table. The night before a major client presentation, I still remembered drawing the first version on a yellow legal pad. Greg continued speaking, confidently, smoothly, as though the work belonged entirely to him. The next slide appeared, then another, and another, each one pulled directly from concepts I'd developed years ago. Not identical, updated slightly, refined, but unmistakably mine. I wasn't angry. Oddly enough, I felt something closer to disappointment, because now I knew, without question, Karen had been right. Greg had spent years building credibility using someone else's ideas. The audience listened attentively, taking notes, nodding, impressed. Then something unexpected happened. Greg became too confident. He started discussing the origins of the framework, and that's where everything unraveled. This strategic model, he said, was developed through years of personal research and leadership experience. Several people continued taking notes, but I noticed Harold glance toward me, then Robert, then a few other executives who knew the truth. The room hadn't changed, but suddenly the atmosphere felt different. Greg kept talking, digging deeper, claiming ownership more explicitly, making the situation worse with every sentence. When he finished, applause filled the room. Then Harold stood. "Thank you, Greg." Greg smiled, relieved, proud, certain he'd done well. Harold waited for the applause to fade, then spoke again. "Before we continue, I'd like to invite someone else to the stage." I felt Robert gently tap my arm. Showtime. My heart started beating faster. Not from fear, from uncertainty. This wasn't planned, at least not by me. Harold looked directly toward my seat. "Linda Harper, would you join me?" The room turned. Hundreds of eyes. Complete silence. I stood slowly and walked toward the stage. Greg's expression changed immediately. Confusion, then concern, then something very close to panic. Harold shook my hand. "Many of you know Linda as an advisor to this merger." A large photo appeared on the screen behind us. Then another, and another. Images from manufacturing facilities, strategy sessions, community events. 3 years of work, 3 years of progress, Harold continued. What fewer people know is that Linda helped design much of the strategic roadmap that transformed Gaines Manufacturing. The audience listened carefully. Several of the frameworks discussed this morning were originally developed by Linda years before this merger existed. The room became very quiet. I saw Greg's face lose color. Harold wasn't finished. A slide appeared showing archived documents, dated presentations, project records, internal reports, each carrying timestamps and authorship records. My name appeared repeatedly. The evidence wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Facts rarely require theatrics. A murmur spread through the audience. People began comparing documents, reviewing dates, reading details. Then Karen stood from the audience. Without being prompted, "She's telling the truth," another former colleague spoke up. Then another. Years of quiet observation suddenly found daylight. No shouting, no chaos, just facts, one after another. Greg remained frozen in his seat. Sandra, who had quietly entered the room earlier, looked absolutely stunned. Not because she didn't know, because she knew everyone else now knew. Harold finally stepped back. The room remained silent for several seconds. Then applause began, small at first, then stronger. Not for humiliation, not for revenge, for recognition, for truth. I looked across the room at Greg. For the first time in years, he couldn't hide behind confidence or charm. All he had left was reality, and reality wasn't on his side. As the session ended and people began leaving their seats, I thought the story was over. I was wrong, because less than an hour later, Greg would come looking for me, and what he asked next would be harder to answer than anything that happened on that stage. By the time the presentation ended, I was exhausted, not physically, emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after years of carrying something heavy and finally setting it down. People stopped me in the hallway. Board members, managers, former colleagues. Some wanted to congratulate me. Others wanted to apologize. A few admitted they should have supported me years ago. I appreciated their honesty, but I wasn't interested in reliving old battles. I spent enough years doing that already. Around noon, I slipped away from the crowd and found a quiet seating area near a set of large windows overlooking the Chicago River. The city looked beautiful in the sunlight. Tour boats moved slowly below. People hurried along the sidewalks. Life continued, just like it always does. I was halfway through a cup of coffee when I heard footsteps approaching. I didn't need to look up. I already knew who it was. Greg stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sat down across from me. He looked older than I remembered. Not dramatically, just tired, like someone who hadn't slept much. "Can we talk?" I stared out the window for another second before turning toward him. "We're talking." He nodded slowly. For once there was no performance, no polished executive persona, no carefully rehearsed confidence, just a man sitting in the consequences of his own decisions. I didn't expect any of that. I know. He rubbed his hands together nervously. I honestly didn't. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction, maybe even triumph. Instead, I mostly felt calm. That surprised me. 3 years earlier, I had imagined dozens of revenge scenarios, arguments, confrontations, perfect speeches, moments where everyone finally understood what happened. Real life turned out differently. The victory wasn't in defeating Greg. It was in no longer needing to. After a long silence, he finally spoke again. "Are they going to remove me from the project?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was such a Greg question. Not, "How are you?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I hurt you." His first concern was still his career. "I don't know." He looked down. "Harold won't even return my calls." I said nothing. Greg swallowed. Then came the sentence I never expected to hear. "I need your help." There it was. The reason he had come. Not reconciliation. Not closure. "Help?" He leaned forward slightly. "You have influence now." The words hung in the air between us. Influence. 3 years ago, Greg believed influence belonged exclusively to people like him. People with titles, corner offices, executive parking spots. Now he was asking the woman he once dismissed for a favor. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "You think I should intervene?" I asked. "I think," he stopped. "Start it again. I think maybe you could explain things." "Explain what?" "That it wasn't intentional." I stared at him. For several seconds, I genuinely didn't know how to respond. Not intentional. He had used my work for years, repeatedly, publicly, professionally. The evidence wasn't ambiguous, and deep down he knew that. His eyes told me so. Finally, I asked the question that mattered. "Greg, if nobody had discovered it, would you have told anyone?" His shoulders slumped. The silence answered for him. I nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." For the first time, he looked genuinely ashamed. Not embarrassed. Ashamed. There is a difference. Embarrassment is about how others see you. Shame is about how you see yourself. At least that's what I've learned. He looked toward the window. I was stupid. Yes. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal. People do that. I didn't think... "No," I said gently. "You didn't." Another long silence followed. Then he surprised me. "I'm sorry, Linda." The words came out quietly, without excuses, without conditions, without trying to redirect blame. Just 4 simple words. "I'm sorry, Linda." 3 years ago, I would have given almost anything to hear them. Now, they landed differently. Not because they didn't matter, because I'd already healed without them. And healing without an apology teaches you something important. Closure doesn't always come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes it comes from deciding to move forward anyway. Greg looked at me, waiting, hoping, maybe believing that apology would change everything. It didn't, but I appreciated it. "I accept your apology." His eyes widened slightly. "Really?" "Yes." A hint of relief crossed his face. Then I continued. "But I'm not going to intervene." The relief disappeared immediately. I wasn't cruel about it. I wasn't angry. I simply told the truth. "Your situation isn't something I created." He looked down. "I know." "You made choices." "I know." "And now other people will make theirs." He nodded slowly. There wasn't much else to say. Eventually he stood. For a moment he seemed unsure whether to shake my hand. Then he simply said, "I hope you're happy." I smiled. Not the triumphant smile he'd probably expected. Just an honest one. "I am." And for the first time I truly meant it. Greg left without another word. I watched him disappear around the corner. Then I finished my coffee. That was the last private conversation we ever had. Over the following months I heard occasional updates through mutual contacts. Greg lost his position. Not immediately, but gradually. Trust once damaged is difficult to rebuild, especially in leadership. Sandra stayed with him for a while. Then she didn't. Apparently, relationships built on betrayal aren't always built on stable foundations. Who could have guessed? As for me, life continued. The merger succeeded. The company expanded. I remained involved as an advisor. Not because I needed the money, because I genuinely enjoyed the work. I also spent more time with family, traveled occasionally, Started volunteering with a local business mentorship program in Rockford. Funny enough, helping people became more rewarding than proving people wrong. Robert liked to remind me of that. About 6 months after the conference, we were having lunch when he pointed his fork at me and said, "You know why you're happier now?" I rolled my eyes. "Here we go." "You stopped measuring your life against theirs." For once he was right. The greatest revenge wasn't exposing Greg. It wasn't watching Sandra walk away. It wasn't hearing people finally acknowledge the truth. The greatest revenge was rebuilding a life that no longer revolved around what I'd lost. For a long time I thought my story was about betrayal. Now I think it was about recovery. About discovering that endings sometimes create room for better beginnings. And maybe that's the lesson I hope someone listening today takes with them. If you've ever been betrayed, underestimated, or left behind, don't spend your life waiting for justice to arrive on your schedule. Focus on building something meaningful instead. Sometimes the most satisfying outcome isn't watching someone else fall, it's realizing you've already moved beyond them. And if this story meant something to you, thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you'll join me again for another story down the road.